So China had a longer deadline. They've held 3 rounds of very intensive negotiations. The expectation is that China's tariffs will continue to be pushed off for another 90 days.
We all remember back in April when Donald Trump stunned the world when he announced the sweeping new tariffs. And then they were put on hold and there was all this kind of panic about what was going to happen. Well, here we are 4 months later and Trump has announced a new wave of levies for now more than 90 countries, and they're going to take effect from next Friday. Now, some are very, very high, like Brazil. Brazil's been hit with 50%, but tariffs overall have been less aggressive than the president threatened back in April. In particular, there's good news for the penguins who live on the Heard and McDonald Islands. All tariffs on that uninhabited Australian territory will stay at a minimum rate of 10% as the UK. I love that. The UK, we're at the same level as the penguins. Pick up a penguin. Very good. And it's just so interesting that this kind of weird Antarctic outpost got itself on this hit list as well. Well, let's now speak with Deborah Elms. Deborah is head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation in Singapore and is a member at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific. Deborah, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So just take us through the tariffs. Who have been hit the hardest and who's got away lightly?
So I think it depends on your benchmark. I would say if you ask me who is feeling the least happy today, top of that list actually would be Switzerland, because Switzerland woke up this morning on National Day in Switzerland to discover a 39% tariff. That's an increase from the 31% they were handed in April. And they've spent a lot of time negotiating what they thought was a comprehensive agreement, or at least as comprehensive as any of these become, to reduce that level. And then to wake up and find it even higher was very upsetting. I think followed closely perhaps by New Zealand, which is not an obvious challenge because New Zealand's tariff is 15%. But given that they had been given a 10% tariff and had a very tiny surplus or a very tiny deficit viewed from the US, they thought that they would stick at 10 and instead they woke up and found themselves at 15. So I think this was described to me earlier as getting your school examination results for the Globe today, and everyone woke up and grabbed the envelope and then looked to see what is the number that we were given. But unlike your exam results, where it's, I would hope, about your ability to do the exam, this time around it was sort of, how did the teacher grade you based on, we have no idea what criteria.
Gosh, that's a really good way of putting it. Global exam results. And also, look, why, Brazil is very high, but also Laos and Myanmar are very high as well with 40%. What's going on there?
I think it's unclear. I suspect that the Trump administration sees both of Laos and Myanmar as being somehow China proxies, although it's a bit unclear. I mean, Myanmar is in the middle of a civil war, and in the middle of all of this year, they've suffered a horrible earthquake as well. And so I don't think there's any way that even if their government had wanted to negotiate, you could have figured out who would sit down next to you. So I think it's a bit challenging, and they trade very little with the United States as a result of that. The original formula made no sense, but at least there was some logic behind it. It took a country's exports to the United States. It divided it by a country's imports from the United States, divided that number in half, and that's how we ended up with crazy numbers. But that's become sort of an anchor, right? So now we're comparing everything to a crazy formula back in April. And the result of that is we've gotten much higher tariffs across the board than any of us were imagining. I think even Trump was himself imagining lower numbers as he was running for office at the end of last year.
So that's so interesting. And look, talk to us about Canada, because they're facing a pretty harsh 35% tariff. Is that based on the formula, or is that based on some quite tricky sort of political chemistry at the moment?
I think they were also very chapped when they woke up this morning, because not only did their tariff go from 25 to 35, but their tariff actually applies already. It started about I don't know, 8 hours ago, where the rest of the world got a 7-day sort of stay of execution at 10% until they rise further. Canada's was handed out with about an hour and a half's notice, escalation to 35%, again, based on it's unclear what. Trump clearly has a strong dislike of Canada, and that doesn't appear to have changed. And so the tariff is now 35% on Canadian imports to the United States, unless they are what is called USMCA compliant. In other words, unless they fit the rules of the US-Canada-Mexico agreement, then they may have an exemption from those tariffs. But as I understand it, that number of products that qualify for lower tariffs could be as little as 40%. That leaves up to 60% of Canadian exports now subject to a 35% rate already in place.
Wow. And just talk to us about two other countries, India and China. What's going on there?
Well, India also, you're asking about all those countries who are angry this morning. India also angry because they received 25%. And again, like Switzerland, the Indians have been negotiating quite enthusiastically with the Trump administration. They've had a longstanding desire to have a greater partnership with the U.S. Modi thought that he had a personal relationship with Trump that would be very valuable. They thought that they were in striking distance to this deal. It's been rumored for several weeks, actually. And then in the end of the day, there was no small agreement. And in fact, the tariff is now 25% starting next Friday. So India, I think, is a watch this space. Maybe they will come back and get something else. With China, China had a longer deadline. China didn't have to have an agreement until August 12th. So China had a longer deadline. They've held 3 rounds of very intensive negotiations. The expectation is that China's tariffs will continue to be pushed off for another 90 days.
Okay. And it's interesting what you say, because, you know, Modi and Trump, it looks on the world stage that they're kindred spirits, that they would get on very well. So, you know, they're both kind of pride themselves on being kind of tough guy leaders. So it's interesting about where India is. Final question to you, Deborah, and you've just explained this all so beautifully today. What do you think this is going to do for the world economy?
I think it's made it harder and harder to trade with the United States, and firms are going to have to think about whether that's worth it to them, because the costs are increasing and the uncertainty remains high. Even after next Friday, I'm sure that there will be many more discussions about Trump and tariff threats that will be applied to all sorts of countries for all sorts of reasons. So you have to think hard about why you would trade with the United States. And that gives an opening, perhaps, to everyone else to say, well, if we're going to restructure the global economy at this point, what would we like it to look like? How can we work together more comprehensively? And especially for the UK, how can you leverage trade agreements like the CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, to actually design arrangements that perhaps are better fit for purpose going forward?
Well, look, Deborah, great to speak with you. Thank you very much for your time. That's Dr. Deborah Elms. They're really interesting. It's so interesting about the countries that are kind of, you know, got a real shock, like Switzerland and New Zealand and India as well. Really interesting stuff there.